Good, I think we'll make a start. Warm welcome to everybody, and welcome to this meeting to try to answer the question, what exactly is happening in respect of Iran's economy? That's a question that matters to the extent that the answer to it has a big bearing on questions relating to Iran's domestic political stability and coherence, and also the degree to which Iran's rulers might feel themselves to be vulnerable to outside pressure in respect of disagreements that Iran has with respect to its nuclear program and other foreign policy considerations. And in the meeting this morning, what we really want to do is to try and examine Iran's economic performance and its trajectory, to consider some of the key policy issues that relate to that, and then to examine the impact and the efficacy of the international sanctions that have been applied to Iran by the international community, and to try and extrapolate from all of that some broader geopolitical consequences and observations. And as the invitation to this event made clear, there is some quite contradictory evidence. There is the statistical evidence that's been presented as against the anecdotal evidence that's been observed. There are disagreements not only internationally among observers who follow these trends, but also apparently within the ruling regime in Iran itself. I myself come from a background of studying China, and in a more remote iteration, China's economic performance, where it's always key to say that there are statistics and Chinese statistics when it comes to economic matters, and maybe that's a principle that also applies to Iran. So we have three speakers today. They'll speak in the order in which they appear on the agenda. We'll start off with Ali Al-Saffar, who is Deputy Editor and Economist for the Middle East at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and he's going to provide an overview of Iran's economic performance and what the forecast is, as much as we can divine it. Then Guy Gantley, who advises the Economics Unit of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on Middle Eastern and North African questions, will have a particularly close look at questions of energy subsidies and some of the other policy issues relating to that. And then my colleague Mark Fitzpatrick, who is Director of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program at the IISS, will focus on the question of sanctions. That's an area in which he's leading a significant body of work here at the Institute. So I'd like to invite then Ali Al-Saffar to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and good morning to you. I'm going to briefly go through Iran's key economic fundamentals, both as they stand today and how they will look 5 years down the line in our estimation. It's an extremely difficult task, as Adam said. That's made all the more difficult by the fact that there's a distinct lack of data coming out of Iran, and the data that does come out is not always trustworthy. I'll try to go over that without stepping on the toes of Guy and Mark, because they're going to be speaking in greater depth to certain topics that I'm going to address here. But I'm going to start with growth, so the macroeconomy and the key primer. Now, we're expecting Iran's real GDP to grow by about 2% this year. That's far below potential and far below the regional average. But we expect this trend of underachievement to remain true throughout our forecast period, which runs between 2011 and 2015. And there are two main reasons for this trend of underachievement. Firstly, the single largest component of Iranian gross domestic product is private consumption. And this, we expect, will be hit as a result of the removal of subsidies, which we're going to tackle in greater depth later. And this will be particularly true in the next 2 years, so in the first half of our forecast period. The second is the state of the oil and gas industry. Now, this is the country's economic engine. It accounts for somewhere in the region of 65% of the government's total revenue. And worryingly for Iran, production has been dipping at quite an alarming rate for the last 3 months. They've dipped somewhere in the region of 200,000 barrels a day between May and August alone. And the industry has a depletion rate in Iran of around 330,000 barrels a day a year. And so what that means is that left unattended, Iranian production will decrease 330,000 barrels a day next year compared to this. And so the country desperately needs gas injection projects that are going on in the South Pars gas field to come online to maintain pressure and to maintain production at the vital oil fields. But development in South Pars has been slow and it's been piecemeal. Total pulled out of Phase 11 in 2008 amid tightening international sanctions, and it was replaced by the China National Petroleum Company. But CNPC has also faced its own difficulties and has come under increasing pressure by the government, which recently threatened to expel it in favor of domestic companies to develop the field. So in all, we're expecting a gradual decline in oil production. And with oil prices also set to fall next year from the highs they saw this year, fiscal revenue will take a hit. As a result of that, the budget balance is expected to fall. The net budget balance is expected to fall into deficit next year and stay that way till 2015, so till the end of our forecast period. And despite government rhetoric on China and the expulsion of CNPC, or the talk of expulsion of CNPC, we're expecting China to become an increasingly important economic partner, and that Chinese companies will increasingly maintain a strong interest in Iran's hydrocarbon sector. Much of this is due to simple necessity. Iran is losing friends, and it desperately needs China not only for investment but as a key economic trade partner. Growth in Chinese energy demands will ensure a market for Iranian oil, and this is particularly vital now because Iran has an unsure relationship with India, its other key partner when it comes down to oil exports. These exports have been volatile due to payment problems that India has faced getting money back to Iran. Cash payments have been subject to some considerable problems due to sanctions in different clearing banks in Germany and elsewhere. But China can overcome this problem because the trade relationship between China and Iran, is far more balanced. And if cash payments faced problems, then China could actually agree a barter trade agreement with Iran, and it would be much easier to see that going through. But this adds a new risk dimension. Iran needs, and it will continue to need, substantial foreign currency reserves. The currency, the rial, is overvalued, and the government will at certain points need to step in to shore it up. It did this most recently in June when the currency dipped by about 10%. And the government came in to make sure that it kept its value. The central bank at that time vowed to plow between $1.5 and $3 billion a week into the market to make sure this happened. But declining foreign exchange from oil exports will mean that the government will find it more and more difficult to take such a proactive, such a definitive step to shore up the currency in the longer term. Inflation's another story we need to look at. It's high and it will stay high. The removal of the subsidies are planned to occur over the forecast period, so from now until around 2014 and 15. And we expect prices to rise this year by around 18% as a result, and for inflation to average around 15% between 2012 and 2015. As already mentioned, getting data is extremely difficult. Bank Markazi, the central bank, was recently barred from releasing it, and that responsibility has now gone to the Supreme Council of Statistics. And so any data released needs to be taken with at least a pinch of salt. We think it's being underreported, and I think stories coming out of Iran would support that. So we're facing a position right now where we have higher inflation and tighter fiscal conditions in the future that will squeeze the government's ability to spend to stimulate demand and to stimulate growth, and that will put a pressure on the economy. This, coupled with unemployment, which a recent Gallup poll put at 15%, could translate into serious social pressures for the government to deal with. And with the declining oil revenues, it might not be as well placed to deal with it as it has in the past. So the overall macroeconomic picture is one that is quite sclerotic. It's sluggish. There is growth, and if Iran was in Europe, that would be enough. It would be an unmitigated success. But it's not in Europe, it's in the Middle East. And the underlying structural problems do persist and could become increasingly problematic over the next 5 or so years. Let's not forget there's an election or two, a parliamentary and a presidential election in that time. And the government spending increases that traditionally happen before an election might not be able to do that anymore. The government might not be able to do that anymore. And so we can see even political fissures come into play then. But that's not the subject for today, so I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks very much. That's a very useful introduction. Guy.
I need to press the button.
No, that's fine.
Well, good morning, everybody. My focus is on what might seem a rather arcane subject, the combination of the reform of energy prices and the introduction of large-scale compensation payments, which kicked in at the end of last year. It's arcane and in places inevitably it's technical, but the scale of the change is enormous. It's probably the biggest economic change to the system since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, if not since the revolution. And for better or worse, it's going to have quite a lot of implications, not all of which are clear at this stage. I should echo at the beginning what Ali has said about the difficulty of getting good information. It is very frustrating, and in many cases it's reminiscent of old-style Kremlinology. You have to pick up odd comments, you have to cross-reference odd bits of information to try to get an idea of what is happening. Now, the combination of subsidy reform, that's to say raising previously very low energy and, for that matter, water prices to something approaching world levels, and compensation payments, is fundamentally a very good idea economically. From a purely economic standpoint, subsidized energy is damaging in all ways that will be very familiar. It's damaging to the budget, to which it denies resources. It's damaging to the balance of payments because it reduces the exportable surplus of oil. It encourages overuse of energy and thus misallocation of resources, and it damages the environment. There's no argument globally that subsidies need to be done away with. Furthermore, the method the authorities have chosen, compensation payments, a mixture of cash payments to individuals and in principle, a variety of different forms of support to companies who are affected by higher energy prices, does seem an appropriate way to smooth the transition. And properly carried through, the combination of higher prices, compensation payments, does have the potential to substantially improve economic performance over the medium to long term, and for that matter to provide some early benefit to the balance of trade in oil. Both things which are obviously attractive to the authorities. But the fact that it needs to be, the reforms need to be properly carried through is key. The combination of measures does represent a major microeconomic and macroeconomic shock to the system. Coping with these will be a challenge anywhere, but especially so in a country where economic policy has been very severely compromised in recent years. If it was a good idea economically, it was also, of course, a political opportunity, because the package was bound to have important implications for income distribution and for the control of newly available revenues from the higher energy prices, both of which would be very attractive to a president who has consistently promoted redistribution and enforced closer presidential control of budget resources. I'll run through very briefly the design of the package and the implementation of the package. As far as the design was concerned, the decision was taken to move from one set of fixed energy prices, and water is also part of the package, to another that was closer to world levels. To give you an idea of what's intended, it would be a gradual move over the period of the current 5-year plan to something like 90% of export prices for liquid fuels such as petrol and diesel, and a minimum of 75% for natural gas, accompanied by full cost recovery for electricity water and sewerage charges. Pretty big changes. On the face of it, moving to another set of fixed prices rather than a completely liberalised regime left open the possibility that these new prices could themselves be eroded by higher inflation and devaluation in the future, which does look a risk in view of what's happening. There is, in fact, a provision in the relevant law that suggests that there could be further adjustments to prices under some circumstances which might guard against that. At the early stages, the size of the actual price increases at each stage, because it was meant to be a gradual process, wasn't specified. In the event, the government went for a strongly front-loaded set of price increases last December, accompanied by complex multiple tariff structures for electricity and water, which again was strongly redistributive in intent, designed to protect the poor. You may be familiar with the details, but some simple examples. Subsidised petrol went up by 300%. That sounds a lot, but that's only from 10 cents a litre to 40 cents a litre, which by European standards remains, of course, very low. Price of gas for household consumption was up 500 or 600%. Electricity went up on a sliding scale, which at its upper end was many thousands of percent. Alongside the higher prices was the decision about compensation. The decision was announced in advance that compensation would be provided to a mixture of all Iranian individuals, firms and the government itself to compensate for its own higher energy costs in a ratio of 50 to individuals, 30 to companies, 20 to the government. It's not at all clear what that ratio was based on. But crucially, the emphasis early on was almost entirely on the compensation paid to individuals, which worked out eventually at a rate of around $45 per head per month. And the link of the size of the compensation and the overall sums that implied to the revenues they actually expected to get from the higher prices was always tenuous. And even at the early stages of planning, it looked doubtful whether the revenues raised were going to be sufficient to cover the compensation payments that were planned in the round. And although nowhere was this analysed carefully, it was always clear that the package of price increases and higher compensation to individuals was going to be extremely redistributive, and so it has proved. Essentially, the large poor families are benefiting very substantially. These are families with large numbers of children in many cases who get the compensation as well, who may well not have a car, whose energy consumption is very limited. So by design, the package transferred a lot of money from the professional and middle classes to the poor, and many of the poor were immediately very much better off. In terms of actual implementation of the package, one have to say that in some respects, a very complex change was managed very impressively. The practical arrangements for paying cash compensation to individuals, which involved registration of eventually around 70 million people, creation of bank accounts for those who didn't have bank accounts, and arrangements for payments to those individual bank accounts in advance, the initial payments in advance of the price rises. That was complex, difficult, could easily have gone wrong, but it went okay, and it was supported by an effective PR campaign which preserved public confidence in the change. And this obviously mattered hugely because had it not worked properly, then very large price rises could have stimulated an enormous amount of dissatisfaction or even unrest. Similarly, the introduction of new fuel and utility prices, though it sounds simple, actually involved quite a lot of complex background work on things like software for the new complex tariffs, and that too went through quite well. So, I mean, credit where credit is due, and when you hear people, including the IMF, talk about how well it has gone, I think on the whole they're focused very strongly on how well some administrative aspects have gone. However, even administratively, even in terms of early implementation, not everything has gone smoothly. For one thing, although obviously it was simple enough for the companies concerned to put up prices of petrol and diesel on the appointed date, utility bills for gas and water are issued retrospectively, and there has been widespread non-payment, which has emerged as a big problem. It looks like a sort of revolt by the squeezed middle, by middle classes who've done badly out of the compensation and don't see why they should pay the higher prices. And crucially, and very controversially, although the cash payments to individuals have gone through smoothly, there's been very little sign, so far as one can tell, of payment of the substantial compensation that was promised to companies. Obviously, different companies are affected to different extents. The more energy intensive you are, the more you're affected. And it's not just big companies we're talking about. Trucking businesses, for instance, very, very badly affected. But this has been the cause of many complaints from companies and business associations. So that's the design and the mechanics. Now, what does this mean for the economy? And just to recap, I mean, this is tricky and speculative because there isn't much good information. And not surprisingly, in view of what I've said about utility bills and failure to pay compensation to companies, there does seem to be a budgetary problem. There never was a coherent mechanism, so far as I could see, for managing the balance between new receipts from higher prices and the compensation payments. And there's clear recent evidence that the authorities have had to draw on the general budget and central bank resources to fund the compensation payments, even though the company compensation payments have not on the whole been made. So in other words, it looks as though planned compensation was greatly exceeding the new revenues. Now, in terms of its impact on the overall budget balance, this probably isn't a first order problem at this stage because oil prices are high and the budget in the round is probably still in quite good shape. But it certainly could become an issue if oil prices were, as Ali has suggested, to fall. And even if it's not a problem for the budget balance, my instinct is that macroeconomic policy in the round does give cause for concern. To give you an idea of the scale of the change, the cash compensation payments alone are working out at an annual rate of around $38 billion. That is on top of a baseline of government spending last year of just over 90 billion. So you're talking about a 40+% increase in spending relative to this baseline. Not only that, but you're seeing a big shift of resources towards poorer people who, on the whole, you would expect would consume more and spend less. And potentially, there are big macro implications here. There's a big jump in the money supply, and which could feed inflationary pressure. Now, this is a particularly opaque area. I have very little sight of what the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank are thinking on this. But there's been, I would say, a conspicuous lack of public discussion of the issues, which makes you wonder how much this is under control. And certainly, again, to echo Ali, I think inflationary pressures are building. Now, you'd expect this to happen anyway, simply because the higher energy prices are feeding through. The extent to which they're feeding through has been contained by price controls which the government have implemented. But even on official statistics, the inflation rate is edging up towards 20%. And certainly anecdotally, I pick up a large amount of information to suggest that inflation as it affects most ordinary people is substantially above that and rising. Another crucial issue is exchange rate policy, which now the President personally resisted any devaluation of the currency to accompany the reforms at the turn of the year. as he had for a good time before that. While that might have been helpful in terms of containing inflation, it had a very severe further impact on industrial competitiveness, which had already eroded seriously as the real exchange rate had appreciated in recent years. In very recent weeks, there has been, well, a complex series of events leading to the emergence of a dual rate and a partial devaluation. But, I mean, the overriding point, I think, still applies, that the currency is overvalued and the private sector, as a result, is even more under pressure than it was a year ago. And what we're seeing from this loss of competitiveness combined with the failure to pay the compensation that had been promised is very big problems in the business sector. Investment is contracting, there's talk of widespread job losses, there's a real sense of crisis and pessimism. As if that wasn't bad enough, there's some suggestion that the IRGC is exploiting the situation to buy up faltering private companies, and then of course use its leverage to get a better deal in all sorts of ways. Finally, the balance of payments. I mean, as I said earlier, I think the fairly small impact there has been on energy consumption should in itself have helped the balance of payments a little bit, but one doesn't know what's happening to imports. It's possible that with the compensation payments there's been a surge in spending by poorer people and a further increase in imports. Again, that's not a particular concern while oil prices remain high, but it could be, if oil prices fall, you could see not just the budget but the balance of payments under pressure under those circumstances. And overall, the picture is cloudy in detail. There's much talk amongst local commentators and in the Majlis about economic problems, even about recession. There's absolutely no coherent economic narrative from the government about what is going on of the sort you would hope for, and the reduced availability of statistics. I mean, it's not just a transfer of responsibility for statistics; it's actually a reduction in the number that's available. Suggests to some that the authorities have something to hide. Looking forward, I mean, in the longer term, economic performance will benefit if the new higher prices for energy and water aren't eroded by inflation and devaluation, and if markets are allowed to operate with higher prices being passed through to consumers and to producers, and crucially producers as a result being forced to adapt, high energy producers being forced to become more efficient or to close. But those are two very big ifs. At this early stage, it looks as though the big potential benefits will at best be only partially realised, because relative prices, the price of energy relative to other goods in the economy, have changed only partially. They've been partially blocked by price controls, and because there's little positive evidence that the authorities are actively encouraging the necessary structural change, that they're actually encouraging major change above all in the state-owned enterprise sector. No firm evidence, but I think it's the sort of area where the absence of positive evidence makes you suspect that less is happening than should be happening. Despite a flawed start, I mean, there is still a lot to play for. There's still time for market forces to be allowed to work and for the economy to benefit in the long term. I mean, conversely, if relative price changes prove to be more fully eroded by inflation, and if competitive forces continue to be suppressed, then the potential gains could dissipate. And of course, it's worth saying that even if on this particular front things turn out relatively well, some of the price effects are allowed to feed through, and the efficiency of the economy improves as a result, it certainly doesn't mean that the outlook for the next few years will be transformed. Sanctions and economic mismanagement and poor economic governance in its many forms are going to see to that. I mean, for any Iranian who is concerned mainly about Iran's economic performance, I mean, I think this smacks of disarray, and it looks like a big opportunity which is at risk of being missed. However, if your agenda is not about economic performance per se, but more about income distribution and hands-on control over resources, then the whole episode may seem much more satisfactory, because it's undoubtedly true that the package has made the poor much better off. So I think, to conclude, the intriguing question on which I'd welcome views from anybody here is really why the reform was pushed through. Was it fundamentally because it was the right thing to do for the economy in the long term? And after all, I mean, there is a well-argued case for change, which has been well known within Iran for quite a while. And what's more, pressure from sanctions certainly argues for steps to promote dynamism and growth potential. Or was it for essentially political reasons? I mean, in support of which I would say that there's nothing in President Ahmadinejad's management of the economy since 2005 to suggest any concern with long-term performance, and a lot of what he's done has been economically very damaging. And the limitations in implementation and follow-through would also suggest that this is the case. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. I think the key issue, or a key issue, which has emerged from the first two presentations we've heard, is that of how is economic policy formulated and executed? Which are the agencies and the actors involved? Who has the real power of initiative? Whose views in these things are decisive? In the political realm, it's often said that Iran has a very disaggregated political system with lots of different power centers. So what you alluded to, Guy, in terms of the absence of a compelling, coherent narrative, this question of disarray, is that simply a reflection of the political system, or is something else at issue here? Mark, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you. So the rule on this panel is we all have to start off by complaining about the sparseness and contradictory nature of the data and begging your indulgence that we can't really address the question with any firm conclusions. But in my case, it's even worse, because I'm supposed to talk about the impact of sanctions on the economy and how to disaggregate the impact of sanctions from these other issues, the price of oil, the subsidies reform, and the overall economic management or mismanagement all have a much greater impact on the economy at large than sanctions. Now, the anecdotal evidence, though, is pretty strong that sanctions are having an impact. You talk to embassies in Tehran, they say they get daily complaints from businessmen who can't get insurance, can't get letters of credit, having a real trouble doing legitimate trade. They don't talk too much about illegitimate trade, but I suppose if they were engaged in that, they wouldn't be talking to embassies anyway. Each time there's a new imposition of sanctions by the EU or by the United States, there's an immediate news about Lloyd's insurance, Lloyd's cutting off insurance, or ships being impounded, or port access being denied. But later on, when the insurance, when Iran finds self-insurance, or when the ships get released, or when new front companies are established, there's not a lot of follow-up information. And after all, Iran has a lot of experience in finding ways to get around sanctions. Perhaps the most one can say is that the cost of doing business is driven up by sanctions. And the question about would there ever come a point when the cost is so great that Iran's leadership would make a calculation that it's too high? Well, those imposing sanctions are betting that it will come to that point, but it obviously hasn't yet. About the contradictory examples, Iran notes with pride that its trade with China is booming, projected to go up 50% this year over last year. But the United States points to China pulling out, or not pulling out entirely, but slowing down investment in, particularly in the gas fields. The point was made about Iran's largest state and oil gas group. They delayed exploratory wells in the South Pars gas field, even though they signed the deal last year to do so, and they're coming under pressure from China to get on the stick. China's third largest energy company pulled out of the North Pars gas venture. And this apparently is in response to U.S. pressure. China is not seeking to undertake new ventures. But there are other variables besides U.S. pressure and sanctions. There is the commercial tension that companies experience trying to do business in Iran. But without this new investment in oil and gas fields, as Ali said, production is going to continue to drop by 100,000 barrels a day to 300,000 barrels a day, depending on whose figures you believe, has been the experience over the last several months. Production was 4.2 million barrels per day last year, 4.2 million barrels. The target for 2015 was 5 million barrels, but it's going to be 3.8 to 3.1, a significant drop, and again, that depends on whose figures you believe. And some say that at this rate, Iran will become a net oil importer by the end of the decade. Now, the purpose of the sanctions is not to restrict Iran's trade overall. The main political purpose is to persuade Iran to seek a negotiated settlement to the nuclear problem, and the purpose of sanctions is to cut off Iran's access to the nuclear and missile-related trade to further its aspirations in these areas. Obviously, sanctions haven't brought Iran back to the negotiating table. The negotiations, they weren't talks, exploratory talks, last winter in Geneva, December and January, were a complete nothing. Iran refused to discuss confidence-building measures. They refused to hold one-on-one talks with the United States. They refused even to agree to a date for a future meeting. Iran insisted that it would not discuss its nuclear program unless all sanctions were first lifted and the country's right to enrichment was formally recognized. I think it's interesting to note that it used to be the George W. Bush administration that set preconditions for talks with Iran. Now it's Iran setting the preconditions. Iran does make certain splashes. A gambit last month by President Ahmadinejad saying that Iran would stop the production of the 20% enriched uranium if they were supplied the 20% enriched fuel for the Tehran research reactor on the grounds that, well, they wouldn't need that to produce the 20% enriched uranium anymore. Although one might say, well, what are they producing it for now anyway, since they can't produce the fuel? The need is probably for some strategic weapons purpose in the future. Iran doesn't have a need to even produce any enriched uranium today because it gets all the fuel for the Bushehr reactor from Russia. Russia has signed a contract for the next 10 years to supply the fuel for the Bushehr reactor. That's longer than Russia typically signs these kind of contracts, and they have an agreement to supply it for the lifetime of the reactor. So when Iran says, well, we'll stop producing 20% if we get the fuel, the question should be asked, where's that fuel going to come from? There are two countries that make it, France and Argentina. Neither has very good relations with Iran. Neither, to my knowledge, has actually been asked to supply the fuel. Iran asked the IAEA to supply the fuel. The IAEA doesn't produce it. You got to go to the people who actually supply it. That's why the gambit has not been taken very seriously in most Western capitals. And you might say that Ahmadinejad's suggestion wasn't really anything new. It was Iran's position 2 years ago, before President Obama called their bluff by suggesting the nuclear fuel swap proposal. Iran then and today is asking for enriched uranium fuel from somebody else, but not using its own enriched uranium for that fuel purpose. It wants to keep it for its own strategic use. Still, I don't think that it's purposeful to ignore Iran's suggestion altogether. I think it's worth exploring. But even if it was explored, I don't think there's much likelihood that Ahmadinejad could make any political deal stick. I mean, he couldn't make the fuel swap deal stick 2 years ago, and today he has far fewer political allies in Tehran to support the idea of him driving a consensus in Iran. But I want to make the point that judging the effectiveness of sanctions depends on what one regards as the purpose of these sanctions. And even if they haven't met their tactical success in persuading Iran to come to the negotiating table in seriousness, I think they are helping to delay Iran's acquisition of the capability to produce a lot of nuclear weapons quickly. They're helping to retard the acceleration of Iran's nuclear program. And on that basis, I think they can be judged successful. In an article this month in our survival journal at IISS, my colleague Dina Esfandiari and I argued that sanctions that target Iran's access to international financing services, transportation, and trade insurance are the best way for concerned countries to disrupt its illicit trade. Iran has increasingly turned to the black market now that no legitimate foreign entity will knowingly assist its banned activities in the nuclear and missile fields. And although some illicit goods are still available through the black market, they have to be paid for using internationally accepted currency. And they have to be transported home by vessels and aircraft that are subject to licensing and insurance. Now, to be sure, Iran's enrichment program has not itself slowed. Iran is defiantly producing more enriched uranium every month than it was last year, even though, as I say, it has no civilian purpose for that enriched uranium today. It's employing more centrifuges at this task than it was a year ago, nearly 6,000. And it's installed about 330 advanced centrifuges that are 2 to 3 times more efficient. It also continues to produce more of this 20% enriched uranium that has no civilian purpose today. But the sanctions, as I say, have kept Iran's program from accelerating even faster. Because although Iran's officials insist that Iran's program is self-sufficient, the evidence suggests otherwise. The UN panel of experts on Iran sanctions concluded in a report earlier this year that Iran has difficulty producing some of the critical choke points that are items that are necessary to sustain and advance its centrifuge enrichment program, such as inverters that regulate the supply of power to the centrifuges. Iran's centrifuge program is also based still predominantly on the first generation Pakistani models that don't work so well. It reportedly doesn't have the means to install many more than it has in place now. And it doesn't have sufficient quantities of the hardened steel that are needed for the more advanced second generation centrifuges. So it's got about 300 in place. I don't know how many more it could install. The sanctions that are having the most impact are those that restrict Iran's ability to use the financial system, the international financial system in support of illicit trade. The EU decision in May to extend sanctions to the Hamburg-based European-Iranian Trade Bank leaves only one European-based financial institution available in Europe for Iran's use today. That's the Paris branch of Bank Tejerat. Iran is unable to conduct most business in either dollars or euros. It therefore cannot repatriate payments except through barter trade. Now, in July, Iran had about $20 billion of oil revenue locked up in escrow accounts in China, India, and South Korea. As Ali said, the Chinese accounts have been able to be managed through barter trade, but it's harder to do with countries that don't have much in the way of sales to Iran. So in conclusion, sanctions are likely to continue as the major policy tool of choice in what I have said before is likely to be a long Cold War style standoff with Iran. Sanctions are the default option in between acquiescing to Iran's proliferation activity or undertaking military means to forcibly stop it. In theory, sanctions should also contribute to the prospects for a negotiated outcome by giving Iran's leaders reasons to explore compromise and by creating bargaining chips for its negotiating partners. Sanctions that are imposed today can be lifted during and after future negotiations. But human nature being what it is, people don't respond just to pressure. I got an email last night that wanted me to do something, and I just reacted negatively because it was sort of in the form of you should do this, not let's do it cooperatively. So there has to be some kind of positive inducements. The difficulty is in imagining how to get negotiations underway in the political environment. And when I wrote the article, I talked about the political environment in Iran, where Ahmadinejad seems to be in a no-holds-bar struggle with the supreme leader. But one might also talk about the political environment in Washington and whether one could imagine that President Obama would be able, in this environment, to get a consensus behind a compromise that would lift sanctions on Iran. So I think in the United States in particular, sanctions pressure is only going to increase. And other concerned countries are likely to adopt their own measures, at least by adding additional names to their respective lists of individuals and entities subject to travel. The next report by the International Atomic Energy Agency, coming out in early November, could be the trigger for a further round of sanctions. The IAEA said in its latest report last month that it has increasing concern about possible military dimensions behind Iran's nuclear activity. That report didn't cite any new details beyond the serious examples cited earlier in the year about development work on what certainly looked to be nuclear weapons designs that possibly continued, the IAEA said, after 2004. But IAEA Secretary General Yukiya Amano indicated that more details would be forthcoming soon, so I expect them to be in the upcoming November report. That evidence and Iran's continuing refusal to explain activities that look like they were related to military dimensions will likely spur even greater concern and probably imposition of more sanctions, whether or not they bring Iran to the negotiating table. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm just wondering who sent you that email now. Good. We've had about 45 to 50 minutes of rich presentations, I think, here. So I'd like to now invite your comments and questions in reaction to those. If you want to intervene, please just raise your hand, catch my eye. A microphone will come to you. Please give your name and affiliation for the benefit of the speakers. Who would like? Yes, sir, you at the back.
My name is Andrew Cunningham, and I'm an independent consultant and writer. Could the people on the panel comment on the bank scandal that's erupted, or that we found out about in the past sort of couple of weeks, involving I think is it Bank Melli and Tejerat, and resignations of some key banking figures? Do you think this is emblematic of wider corruption and abuse in the banking system? Why are we finding out about this now? Is there anything behind that? And more fundamentally, do you think that this scandal will lead to changes in the way in which the banking system and the economic system is managed?
Thank you. Who'd like to tackle that?
Well, it's a tough question. It's been in the news so much recently. But as to why it came out now, one can only speculate. There's obviously political dimensions behind everything that comes out of Iran. When news is released, it's usually got some sort of a political dimension behind it. Now, corruption was one of President Ahmadinejad's key rallying calls in his initial presidential bid, and fighting corruption was going to be one of his main raison d'être for his existence there. In my opinion, a lot of this does discredit the president quite a bit, and it comes at quite an opportune time in the battle or the friction between Ahmadinejad on the one side and the deviant current, if you call it that, and the establishment and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on the other. So a lot of it can be actually traced back to that, in my opinion. My understanding of the actual of the case itself is limited, so I'm not going to comment too much on that.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the middle, just by the aisle.
My name is Iraj Bagirzadeh. I'm from IB Tourist Publishers. A follow on to the previous question of corruption. There are enormously widespread and extensive, and there have been for a long time, anecdotal indications of corruption actually permeating all levels of activity in society and so on, which go beyond the massive, the reports of the massive corruption that we've just been hearing about. To what extent does the panel believe that the 2% growth, for example, that you were talking about, and the fact that Iran is not meeting its potential as an economic force, to what extent does corruption actually across the board play a role in all of this? And as a supplementary, if I may, on the question of sanctions, are the sanctions working as a minor irritant, as a major irritant, or do you feel that they actually have, they actually function as a sort of economic existential threat to the country? The final point that I would make, which is in the question, is that Iran, in all sorts of different ways, has all the characteristics of a country which, completely outside the framework of its political problems and international political problems and nuclear issues and so on and so forth, has the wherewithal to join the club of, shall we say, post-BRICS. And 2% growth is nowhere close to putting it in that particular camp. So again, corruption and sanctions, to what extent are they contributing to this holding back of what Iran's economic potential might be?
Mm-hmm. Guy, Ali, do you want to elaborate a little bit what your views are in terms of the phenomenon of corruption? Maybe this also gets to the heart of the balance between the informal and the formal economies, the extent to which the informal economy is responsive to policies that might be formally articulated and so on. Guy?
Yeah. It's not an area I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I think there's a general consensus that corruption is a widespread problem, as it is in many countries in the region. But I think the factors holding back growth go a lot wider than just corruption, and for that matter, just sanctions. And sanctions, since you mentioned them, are certainly impacting growth. Not least because they are impeding investment in the hydrocarbon sector, which for the medium to long-term prospect is absolutely fundamental. But the fact that Iran is underperforming economically, whatever exactly you think the growth rate might be, and all figures are suspect, reflects sustained poor governance and poor economic policy formation, which has only worsened in the last 5 years or so. You have only to look at the way the president has interfered with the operation of the central bank, overriding its attempts to conduct a sensible monetary policy. The way he has eviscerated the management and planning organisation, which was a major force for good economic governance and stability, at the misconceived shares of justice scheme, at the initiatives to encourage the banking sector to make what were notionally loans but were clearly never going to be repaid to embryonic small businesses. I mean, all that is hugely damaging to business confidence and the effective allocation of resources.
Yes. Sorry if I could just jump in at this time. There's also the factor of the loss of efficiency, and that's something we actually have to consider quite closely. Now, recently with the new energy minister, we heard that Khatam al-Anbiya might be taking a more proactive role in the energy industry in Iran. And so with these kinds of appointments, with the expulsion of, for example, foreign companies and their replacement with domestic companies that might not necessarily be have gotten the contract based on merit, then corruption can lead to inefficiency as well, and there's an obvious loss in that scope.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to respond to the
yes,
sanctions point?
I'm glad, Iraj, that you gave me a multiple choice question. It's a lot easier than fill in the blank. And so are sanctions a minor irritant, major irritant, or existential threat? I'll go for the middle option. They're a major irritant. When your ships are impounded, when you can't import using the company that you've contracted with to run your ports, that's a major irritant. Now, Iran is able to find workarounds over time, but on the other hand, the United States keeps finding new levers to apply. So, I can't quantify the impact or how much more growth there would be without sanctions, but I think it's pretty clear that they are a major irritant.
Thank you. You in the front, second row, sorry, on the left-hand side. If you just wait for the microphone to get second row in the front.
Ina Lazareva, a member of the Institute. A question about Syria and Iran. There were some reports that Iran provided Syria with up to $5 billion plus 290,000 oil barrels a day. Does the panel think that the state of the Iranian economy would allow for this? And linked to this, if I may, below what oil market price would the Iranian budget begin to unravel? Thanks.
Perhaps, Guy, on the energy side, you want to respond to that on the fiscal question. Anything you want to say about Iran-Syria economic relations? And then Mark, perhaps on the wider strategic relationship between Iran and Syria?
I mean, if I may, I'd comment actually on the second leg of the question, on the required oil price. I find this very difficult. I know there are publicised estimates of the required oil price of the order of $100 to $110 a barrel, but I've never seen a satisfactory working through of those estimates, and it's the whole exercise is greatly complicated by the fact that there are at least two main definitions of the budget in play. There's the restricted general government budget, which the IMF and others focus on, and then there's the budget as usually referred to within the country, which includes public companies. And it's also not clear to me whether some of the more recent estimates take adequate account of the new revenues from the subsidy reform. So while I'm clear that the break-even price has gone up fairly sharply in recent years, whether it is 80, 90 or 100, I'm afraid I don't know. I mean, it's not for want of trying to come to an estimate, it is just very opaque.
On the issue of whether it can afford to disburse $5 billion in aid to Syria, at the moment it probably can. It's flush in oil money now. Oil prices have been very high all year. But whether it can continue to afford that in the medium and long term is questionable. And I think there's already been mention of the fact that policy, fiscal policy, economic policy in general, isn't necessarily very coherent, and so maybe thinking of the more medium to long term impact, it can't afford it. But the immediate effect is that it can.
Thank you. Mark has yielded the balance of his time, so we'll go to the next question. Lady at the back, right at the back, last row. No, last row. Thank you, and then we'll come back to you. Sorry.
Hello. Just a short question. Do you think that this increasing sanction is a prelude to U.S. attacking Iran, just as happened in Iraq?
Mark.
I think the increasing sanctions are a substitute for more forceful action. And as long as there is a belief that the sanctions might work, they will continue to be a substitute. It will depend on how close Iran gets to crossing a tripwire of a perception of actually producing nuclear weapons. And it's a perceived tripwire because the actuality may not be exactly known. And what defines the tripwire is also not quite known and probably differs among countries. I don't think that the sanctions are a part of a strategic plan to drive toward military action. I don't doubt that there are people who see it that way, both people who want the military action and people who oppose it. But I've never been in any discussions with anybody in an authoritative role who has said that's the plan.
Thank you. Yes, we'll go now to the lady in the middle. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you. My name is Rana Fagali, and I'm a member of the Institute. Staying with the subject of sanctions, Mark mentioned Iran's use of front companies to try and elude sanctions. Now I was wondering if the panelists can give some more detail on where those front companies are. Are they in Dubai? Are they in Oman? Are they in China? Are they in Central Asia? And actually what types of front companies these are?
The evidence that I've seen suggests that whereas the front companies used to be concentrated in the Gulf region and Dubai in particular, that the UAE government's crackdown and additional requirements has driven out a lot of those companies, and they have found a more hospitable home in other places, including in Turkey. I don't single out Turkey exclusively, but it's the one that one hears about most often. Trading opportunities in Southeast Asia also provide avenues for front companies, and some Southeast Asian countries have not been very rigorous in applying regulations to try to prevent such front companies from operating.
In the front row here, Kyo.
Thank you. Joe, Asia and Pacific Affairs. Mark, you did say about the political environment in Washington and, of course, Tehran. If I may go off the tangent a bit, I'm interested in a little bit political environment in Moscow. You did talk about enriched uranium deal. There is a possibility, is there not, that we're likely to see Mr. Putin back again in driving seat. Should this happen, is there a likely scenario that Russia's arms policy towards Tehran may change, especially in the fields of sophisticated air defense systems?
That's a very good question, and I think you've pointed to the answer in your question. When Russia broke the contract with Iran to supply the S-300 air defense systems, it appears to have been a decision put through by President Medvedev. And it's been speculated that somebody else might not have made the same decision because it wasn't required by the UN sanctions. It's, I think, very interesting to note that Russia went above and beyond what was required by the UN sanctions and probably did not get the credit for that as much as they should have in Washington. So whether Mr. Putin would change that, I mean, the contract has now been broken. It's been going through some legal challenges, and I'm just not in a position to speculate what is likely to be the outcome of that. But a different president might make a different decision in the future.
Thank you. Further questions, comments? Yes, please. Second row.
Thank you.
That's working.
Thank you. Gordon Barris, London School of Economics. I mean, what do we think that the Iranian leadership at the moment is trying to do? I mean, are they really wanting a way out of this situation? Or really is it they're just playing a much longer game to achieve a nuclear capability? Because I think that it is only if one has a reasonably clear understanding of that, one can make an assessment about how the sanctions are fitting in.
That's a good point. It's another one for you, Mark.
Okay. By the way, just thank you for Gordon. But let me just, I should have said in response to the last question that it doesn't depend on just who's in power in Moscow. It depends on the nature of the Russia-U.S. relationship. And the reason Medvedev made the decision was because of the reset in relations, and he saw it as a way to continue that reset. So if U.S. relations with Russia prospered under President Putin, I think he might make the same decision. What does the Iranian leadership want? What are they trying to do? I don't think there's a lot of evidence that they're looking for a way out. Although, let's be fair, when Foreign Minister Salehi was in New York recently, and he talked about this suggestion that Iran would be willing to stop production of 20% enriched uranium. He spoke about it in those terms. It's a way for Iran to try to do something that would produce goodwill. He said they didn't need the fuel; they could produce it themselves, although they can't quite do it yet. So, I don't doubt that there are some in Iran who are seeking some way to look for, if not a way out, at least a tactical measure to reduce the pressure. But long term, it looks pretty clear to me that Iran's intentions are to have the ability to produce a nuclear weapon if they make a decision to do so. And I just don't see a lot of other reason to be producing this stockpile of enriched uranium that they don't need for economic purposes and for all this evidence of a military purpose. I mean, the IEA says that it has a body of evidence provided by a number of countries and developed through its own sources that point to nuclear activity of a possible military dimension. Now, they wouldn't say that if they weren't pretty confident that the data they've got is good stuff. It's not just one manufactured laptop with data in it. So there's a lot of signs that point to that is their goal. Now, that doesn't mean that their goal is to produce nuclear weapons, but they want the capability to do so. And they can postpone the decision once they are close enough to make it worth their while. It's not worth their while today, even if they could produce one nuclear weapon in what I estimate is a little less than 2 years. One weapon wouldn't, I don't think it would do much for them. So I think they'd want to get a handful, and that's in some future date. We still have some time for diplomacy if there was a political environment in Washington and in Tehran and in Moscow to make it happen.
Yes, please.
Tim Verity from King's College. Could I ask, what's the position of Israel in all this? They compromised the Iran nuclear plan through their virus. Is that being a success? I got the impression that was more of a short-term success. How does Israel view the long term? Are they planning an attack? How are they coming to terms with Iran's plans?
I don't think Israel has changed its position that they cannot accept a nuclear-armed Iran, often phrased as they cannot accept a nuclear Iran or they cannot accept a nuclear-capable Iran, but frankly, Iran's already nuclear-capable. It would take them the time to do it. Israel's position is that it would like to satisfy, it would like to resolve this problem through peaceful means. It does not want to use military might to try to stop the program. They realize the difficulty of doing it, the probability that the program would be reconstituted in some period of time, and that there would be enormous repercussions for Israel and the region and the world. And but as I said to begin with, they cannot accept a nuclear-armed Iran. So if Iran gets to that point where they are about to begin production, then I think there would be military action taken at that point. I don't think today it would happen because Iran is not at that point.
Thanks. Can I just bring Guy and Ali back to this question that I raised before about the formulation of economic policy? I mean, it would be fascinating to hear from you how you think, from your study of Iran, that process actually transpires. Who are the personalities and the agencies that lay observers of the Iranian scene should be focusing on? How do we interpret the criminology that you refer to in particular? How are these questions arbitrated within the system? I think that would be a very useful guide to helping us to sort of understand the complexity and maybe the chaos through which this occurs. So, I mean, is that Guy or Ali who wants to kick off on that?
Well, my perception is that Ahmadinejad has been a much more assertive presence on economic policy than his predecessors, even than Khatami, who was instrumental, I would say, in pushing economic policy in general in a fairly reformist direction. I've already referred to Ahmadinejad's tendency to interfere with the operations of the central bank, which was previously pretty independent and a very much respected centre of economic competence and an anchor for economic stability. And I've referred also to what he did to the Management and Planning Office. He also, I think, has tried hard to subordinate the whole budget process much more to him by greatly reducing the amount of detail in the budget bills that are submitted to Parliament each year, and furthermore submitting them very much at the last minute in order to limit the Parliament's ability to change his initial plans. I think the whole run-up to the subsidy reform process was also quite interesting. It was very much Ahmadinejad's project, and from the earliest point he was focused on the new resources that higher revenues were going to release, and he was extremely keen that those resources should be under the presidency's control rather than part of the budget. So in all sorts of ways, and I could probably include also the economically very ill-advised price controls we've seen in recent months, I think it has been a much more assertive presidency, and given Ahmadinejad's economic instincts, not a helpful one from the point of view of economic policy. I'm not myself clear to what extent the political balancing agents like the Expediency Council have played a major role in economic policy.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of what we've seen in the political sphere it's got the populist blueprints or the footprints of the populist president, really. It's difficult to tell. It's an extremely murky area. There was intervention in the central bank's dealings, but he was kicked off the board. And I think who did the kicking off will be able to, if we knew that, then we'd be able to tell who is the countercurrent to the president when it comes down to the economy. But I think it's privy to the same sorts of struggles that the political situation in Iran is, the internal political situation is. And so we're going to have the president on one side, and then perhaps Parliament on the other, and with some sort of oversight from the clerics. And I don't think they should be discounted too easily when it does come down to it. The president has tried to enact several changes recently, and even though it's not directly linked to the economy, it does go some way towards showing that he has been stopped in the past, and that was the proposed merger of ministries. Now that was stopped by the powers that be beyond him, and so I think it would be unuseful to actually think that the president could do everything himself when it comes down to the economy. I think there are characters that we might not be able to see very well now that put a certain measure of checks and balances, not necessarily to ensure that he's taking better economic policy, but that do stop him nonetheless.
There's a question at the yes. You keep your hand up to the microphone. Yes, you.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. I wondered how the economic situation would impact on the elections, which you mentioned, both parliamentary and presidential, will be coming up. Because it would appear from what Guy was saying very wisely that the subsidy policy has been very much a populist thing, whereas probably the Green Movement, which is largely a middle class thing, I would imagine, would probably be in a stronger position when the elections occur.
Who wants to tackle that? No? Well, yes, all right.
I'll have a shot.
Don't all strain at once, by the way.
I spoke initially that the feeling is that the government will be in a much more restrained position to spend the way it has before with the previous election and the next election. It might be that by 2014-15 they're suffering from quite a large deficit when it comes down to, by Iranian standards, I mean it might be 3%, but it's still a deficit, and financing that deficit is not necessarily going to come very easily. Iranian debt's going to probably be quite expensive. And so Ahmadinejad's instincts of spending, of populist spending, might not necessarily be realized simply because he just doesn't have the money. But what I have been hearing anyway is that the recent shift in Ahmadinejad's rhetoric has been towards placating the middle class, and that is a shift from his previous stance of really trying to speak to the downtrodden, to the poor. So maybe he doesn't want to spend because he cannot spend. No, he won't. But I'm sure that he's trying to put a candidate that he feels comfortable with forward, and so he doesn't want to be remembered as the president who took the economy to hell. And so I imagine spending at that time is probably going to he will try to increase spending at that time.
Add anything?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to get into the politics themselves, but I think it's worth saying that, if I'm right, we've yet to see the full consequences of the subsidy reform and compensation package work through. I mean, there are very large inflationary pressures in the system, and whilst just at present a very significant proportion of the population must still be, in real terms, better off than a year ago, I think progressively more and more people are going to see those initial real gains completely eroded and are going to end up worse off than they were before. So quite how far that goes, I don't know. It depends on the success of poorly documented, poorly visible macroeconomic policies and on the extent to which price controls and so on stay in place. But I think even without a fall in the oil price, there's a good chance that any initial feel-good factor from the subsidy reform process will have worn off. Quite how that plays into the election is for others to decide. And of course, if we do see a fall in the oil price, which with the global outlook is looking a bit more of a possibility now, then things are going to be even more difficult.
Interesting. Yes, please. Just by the wall.
Thank you. Kenneth Flaherty from the Foreign Office. Several of Iran's neighbours have been facing growing demographical challenges in recent years with very large young populations. To what extent does Iran face similar or different demographical challenges, and how do they affect the issues that you've been discussing today?
Demographics?
I think it suffers the same problems that the rest of the region does. The poll that I mentioned earlier, the Gallup poll that said there was 15% unemployment, also said there was a 26% suffering rate. So, I mean, I don't know how that necessarily is classed, but it does point towards some sort of a demographic problem that they're going to have, and I think that's probably going to increase. The region has the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. And we saw that the Green Movement was very heavily influenced by the youth, and so was the Arab Spring recently. And so it will face these pressures. It needs employment. It cannot afford to have young graduates who are unemployed or underemployed. And so my feeling is that it will face many of the same pressures the region does itself. Another pressure it's going to face, you brought the region, and I'll just mention it quickly, is the falling oil production as a matter of national pride, I think, almost, is going to be a problem. Now we see production in Iran reaching 3.51 million barrels a day. That was in August. That's minuscule compared to what it should be producing. And its neighbor in Iraq is producing 3 million barrels a day by the end of the year, or will be. And so once that shift happens, once that shift in power, the power balance happens, at least as far as oil is concerned, it's going to be quite difficult for the government to explain it. And so that's another thing that needs to be considered.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could make a few slightly more optimistic comments. I mean, for one thing, my understanding is that the demographic problem isn't as acute as it is in much of the Arabian Peninsula, for a start. I mean, certainly the growth rates are nowhere on the scale that you see in Yemen or Saudi Arabia. Last time I looked at the figures, I think the population growth rate had tailed off some years ago. You're still seeing a bulge in the population of working age coming through, but longer term it's not so much of an issue. And for the longer term, and I mean, going back to an earlier question about whether Iran could be a post-BRICS country, I mean, I think it is worth saying that once sanctions are out of the way and once crazy economic management is out of the way, Iran has enormous intrinsic advantages. It has every prospect of becoming a very successful, diversified economy based on an exceptionally good workforce, a good resource endowment, including, of course, its gas reserves, which are potentially very valuable. So, I mean, whilst it's difficult to be optimistic about the short term, it's difficult to be pessimistic about the long term.
If I can ride that optimistic crescendo, actually, about the prospects of Iran and the possibility of it coming out good. The structure of the Iranian society and its interaction with the state is one that's probably quite a lot less rentierist than many of its neighbors, and so that's a form of optimism I think you can take out of it. But on the demographics, true, population has dropped, but that's when birth control became good with the state. And I think they're reversing that position now, so I think we need to factor that in. Yeah.
I think there was a question at the back. Am I right? Yes, please.
I'm Theo Milanopoulos. I'm an intern here at the Institute. I was curious about what you think it is that makes these sanctions so effective in terms of isolating Iran from the financial system. Many of the multilateral sanctions seem to target specific entities and individuals associated with Iran's program, some dual-use components, whereas it seems to be the more unilateral measures that are more effective in isolating Iran financially. Does that suggest that perhaps these might be more effective ways of pursuing these kinds of pressures in the future?
Mark.
I think what accounts for the effectiveness of financial sanctions is that it's an area where a smaller number of countries have a kind of monopoly position in providing the reinsurance, in providing the exchange mechanisms. If Iran can't use the two currencies that are most in use internationally because they can't have banks or access to the European or U.S. financial systems, they're at a disadvantage, and it's hard for banks in China to make up for that. And that, you pointed to why the United States will continue to look for areas in which it can employ leverage through less than universal application of sanctions. But because they're not universal, Iran will, being resourceful, continue to find workarounds, and this game of cat and mouse isn't a good analogy, but the game will continue. Tit for tat will continue.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions before closing at 12, if there are any. If there are no takers, I think we'll draw it to a close there. I'd simply say, by way of wrapping up, I think that the discussion that we've been having this morning has highlighted the need for a much better understanding of the interaction of economic and political and strategic questions. And it's with that in mind that the Institute is in the process of launching and rolling out a new research program on geoeconomics and strategy. And we are going to be making a number of appointments to the research staff to reflect that new priority, and we look forward to introducing them to you in due course. The program gets underway later this month in our Middle East office, where we'll be having a discussion about the strategic and geoeconomic interaction between the Gulf states and the Asia Pacific, where we're bringing together business people, strategists, really trying to bridge two communities that significantly live in isolation, one could think. We want to break down that stovepiping, and I think, as I say before, this meeting has demonstrated perhaps the wisdom of doing that. Can I please invite you to join me in thanking the three speakers that we've been hearing today? Thank you.